Thank you for joining us. I am Lauren Apter-Bairnsfather, Director of the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh, and I am so pleased to welcome today's guest, Dr. Rebecca Jacobson. Dr. Jacobson is the daughter and granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. Her mother, Judith, was a small child living with her parents, Esther and Kalman Seinfeld, at the beginning of World War II. And we'll hear that story today. Over the past 3 years, Rebecca has assembled her family's stories of survival during and after the Holocaust. In her professional life, Rebecca is a physician who has held leadership positions in academic medicine and healthcare. She's now president of a healthcare startup company. Pittsburgh has been her home for the past 25 years. She is married, and together she and her husband, Jake, have 4 children. She's also a dedicated volunteer with the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh, serving on our Life and Legacy Committee and as chair of the Generations Steering Committee. In 2020, Rebecca and her husband, Jake, were recognized as the Holocaust Center's Volunteers of the Year in the Pittsburgh Jewish Chronicle, and I am so happy you're here with us. So I'm turning it over to you now, Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. This family portrait was taken almost 100 years ago, in 1924 or 1925. This is my family, the Feldman family. This little girl in the bow is my grandmother, Esther, who was 11 or 12 years old at the time. Behind her is her father, Aaron David. He was an engineer who built airports. In front of her is her mother, Hannah, who is holding Esther's baby sister, my Aunt Bella. Next to them is her little brother, Menashe, 2 older sisters and another brother in the back, and her brother, Elias, who was married to Gitla. Gitla is holding my cousin, Julius. The man in the center is Abram Lubart, my great-great-grandfather. And over here is Hannah's brother, Shaya, with his wife, Vega. Shaya and Vega had 3 children, Mordechai, Bronik, and Bina. My grandmother, Esther, grew up in Warsaw, the capital of Poland. Here she is as a young woman, and here's how I remember her. In fact, that is me with my grandmother, who I used to call Bubba. Although she sometimes dyed her hair dark, most of her life she was naturally blonde, and she always had her hair perfectly done, never a strand out of place. While Esther was a young woman living in Warsaw, she met and married Kalman Seinfeld, my grandfather. This is my grandfather when he was a young man, and here he is later in life. In retrospect, he was kind of a tough guy. My mother, Judith, was born in Warsaw, Poland on June 11th, 1936. And the music you're hearing is from a famous Polish composer, Frédéric Chopin. This was a piece of music that my mother, Judith, loved to play on the piano. This piano that I've inherited from her. I remember her playing this piece when I was a child. Her music would fill our home. And although this recording isn't her, it sounds exactly like the way I remember her playing it. At the time this family portrait was taken, Warsaw was a beautiful and elegant city with wide tree-lined boulevards and a network of streetcars that linked up every part of the city. It was such a cosmopolitan city that the streetcars would actually run all night long. There was music and art and theater. People would walk down the boulevards, meeting friends and stopping at cafes. My family was and is Jewish, and Warsaw in the 1930s was also a center for Jewish life in Poland, and in fact in all of Europe. There were more than 3 million Jews in Poland and about 400,000 Jews who lived in Warsaw. Some were observant Jews and others were not. In my own family, you can see that there is a spectrum from Abram, my great-grandfather, who was a scholar. He was very religious, and you can see this from his more traditional clothing, the long coat, his long beard, and his kippah or head covering, to my uncle Elias, who was clean-shaven and he wore a three-piece suit. About 15 years after this picture was taken, when my mother was 3 years old in 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, and everything changed for the Jews and for my family. Immediately after the annexation, Jews were ordered to wear Jewish stars so that they could be easily identified. They were no longer permitted to work, and their movements were restricted. When the Nazis invaded Poland in 1939, 15 years after this picture was taken, my grandmother's father, Aaron David, and her grandfather, Abram, had already died. Several of my family members were deported to work camps shortly after the invasion, including my grandparents, who were in their 20s, and my mother, who was about 4, as well as my Aunt Bella, who was 16 at the time, and my great-grandmother, Hannah, who was in her 50s. My grandparents and my mother were sent on a crowded freight train to a work camp in the countryside, which was one of my mother's earliest memories. But much of the Jewish population of Warsaw, including much of the rest of my family, were moved into one part of the city, which was called the Warsaw Ghetto. Now, you may have heard the word ghetto used to describe a neighborhood where minorities live, or maybe where people live who are poor. But the word ghetto was actually first used to describe places that Jews lived in cities. The Nazis set up ghettos all over Poland and all over Europe. And you can see all of the ghettos on this map, but one of the largest ones was in Warsaw. If you were Jewish and you already lived inside the boundaries of the ghetto, then you had to stay. But if you were not Jewish, you had to move outside the ghetto. The German soldiers walled off that part of the city, and they separated the Jews from the other Polish people, who were primarily Christian. Then they forced the Jews from Warsaw and then other parts of Poland to move into the ghetto. In this tiny area of about 1.5 square miles, there were eventually 450,000 Jews, about 1/3 of Warsaw's population. My grandmother's older sisters and brothers and their families, my cousin Julius, his 2 parents, Elias and Gitla, and his younger brothers, Avraham and Israel, who were not born at the time that this portrait was taken. Shaya and Fega and their children were also in the Warsaw Ghetto. Life inside the ghetto was very hard. Conditions were crowded. There was hardly anything to eat. While half of my family was trapped in the ghetto, my grandparents and my mother were in a work camp where my grandparents did forced labor. I'm not exactly sure which work camp they were in at this time. This picture shows a work camp near Warsaw. Amazingly, my grandmother had sewn a gold watch into the clothes that she was wearing, and so they used it to bribe a guard to let them out. After their first escape, they went through a period of being on the run, moving from town to town around the outskirts of Warsaw. wherever my grandfather could get a job in a factory or as a laborer, and my mother and my grandmother would stay home and out of the way. Whenever anyone started asking questions or looked suspiciously at them, they would pack up everything and move on to the next town. One day they were there, and the next day they weren't. During this time, the three of them were still together, but it didn't last. One day, my grandfather was at work when policemen came in. They asked the workers if there were any Jews among them, and everyone turned and pointed at my grandfather. Apparently, even though he thought he was passing for a Christian, everyone else knew he was a Jew, and the police took my grandfather away to be deported to another camp. My grandmother was frantic because my grandfather didn't come home from work that day, and she didn't know what to do. She took my mother and she returned to Warsaw, even though she knew her family was in the Warsaw Ghetto, a place that she did not want to go. She had very little money, nowhere to stay, and a 5-year-old child. The only thing she could think to do was to get onto the streetcar and keep riding until she could come up with a plan. She went back and forth across the city on one of these streetcar lines all night long, terrified that someone might see her, someone that knew her from her former life, someone that would recognize her and could turn her over to the police. In the morning, a female conductor got on the train, the same conductor that had been on duty the night before. My mother and my grandmother were the only ones on the streetcar at that point, and the conductor recognized them from the previous evening. She came right over to my grandmother and said that she knew they were Jews. And then she said something amazing. Her name was Stefja, and she offered to hide them. That started a period of several months where my mother and grandmother lived in hiding in Warsaw with Stefja, the trolley driver, who risked her life to save two people that she did not know. Eventually, Stefja helped them to get false papers, passports that had fake names. Instead of Esther, an obviously Jewish name, my grandmother's new name would be Mary, a more Christian name. My grandmother made up an entirely different life in order to explain why she had a 5-year-old child. She claimed to be the wife of a Polish soldier on the Russian front. And eventually, with her fake identity, my grandmother and my mother moved into a small apartment in Warsaw, not far from the Warsaw Ghetto. My mother and grandmother passed as Christians, although they were Jews. And there were some things about them that made it easier for them to do this. My grandmother had blonde hair and blue eyes, and my mother had fair skin and red hair. So they didn't look as Jewish as some of their relatives. My grandmother and mother also spoke fluent Polish, and my grandmother spoke fluent German, which was unusual for Polish Jews, many of whom only spoke Yiddish. While living as a Christian woman, my grandmother experienced what was one of the most terrifying events of her life. She was invited to dinner at a neighbor's apartment, and one of the guests was a Nazi officer who sat directly across from her. My grandmother stayed throughout the entire dinner and spoke to the officer in German, all the while knowing that if he suspected anything, it would be the end for her and for my mother. Incredibly, during this time in Warsaw, my grandfather turned up one day. He had escaped from the concentration camp where he was sent by digging his way under a wall. I don't know how he found my grandmother and mother, but somehow he did, and they were briefly reunited. But it was dangerous for them to be together. Like almost all Jewish men, he was easily identified by his circumcision. So if the police arrested him, they could know immediately that he was Jewish. He could not stay with them in Warsaw. It was too dangerous for my mother and grandmother. But he couldn't stand to be away from them either. How could they explain who this man was while they lived with their other identities? And they had another problem. My grandmother was becoming incredibly nervous, and they worried that her nervousness would arouse suspicion by the neighbors or by the authorities. So they made up an elaborate story. My grandmother told her neighbors that she was having an affair with the man who was in reality my grandfather, her real husband. And so when he came to visit, there was a reason for his brief stays and also for my grandmother's panicky behavior. Some of her neighbors might disapprove, but as long as they didn't suspect the truth, it would be okay. But other neighbors felt differently. Mary, they would say, he loves you and your daughter so much. Why don't you just leave your husband and marry him? For a second time, my grandfather was captured and once again sent to the camps, but amazingly, he escaped again. He had been put on the last car of the train with other Jewish men and a guard. While the train was stopped, the men overpowered the guard and then vanished into the forest. These papers from the German government show my grandfather's record, including the camps where he was held during the war. In April of 1943, when my mother was 6 years old, the Nazis entered the ghetto with tanks and soldiers with the intention of deporting everyone who was there. But many Jews inside the ghetto had decided they would not go. They were going to fight. For almost 1 month, a few hundred Jews resisted the Nazis from inside bunkers and hiding places with weapons that they had smuggled into the ghetto. Early on, much of the fighting of the Warsaw Uprising took place in a part of the ghetto called Muranau Square. When the Jews resisted, the Germans set fire to everything in the ghetto. Many of the Jews who remained died in the ghetto, shot by the Germans or burned in the fires. But many, many more were deported to the Treblinka concentration camp where they were murdered. While the uprising was happening, my grandmother and mother were still living in Warsaw. On that night that the Nazis set fire to the ghetto, my grandmother was thinking of all her family that was there. Many of the Polish people who lived in the neighborhood around my mother and grandmother were happy when the ghetto burned, knowing that the Jews were being killed. And they came out into the streets to celebrate. My grandmother, who was living as Mary, a Christian woman, took her little girl, my mother, out to the street too, and pretended to celebrate, afraid that if she had not, or if she seemed upset about the ghetto burning, that she would give away their real identities. It's a night that my grandmother relived frequently throughout her life, wrestling with what she should have done, and whether she had betrayed the memory of her brothers and sisters, aunts, uncles, nephews, nieces, cousins. I remember talking about it with her one day. Baba, I said, the Polish name for grandmother. You had to save yourself and Mom. You had to do it. And she would stare off, nodding. But I think in her mind, it was never really resolved. In retrospect, with the exception of my cousin Julius, who was a teenager and remained in the ghetto until very close to its destruction, my research suggests that most of my family had already been sent to Treblinka and killed long before the night my grandmother remembered. 1 year before the ghetto was destroyed, in the summer of 1942, more than 250,000 Jews were sent from the Warsaw Ghetto to their death at the Treblinka concentration camp. This picture shows Umschlagplatz, the place where Jews waited for the next train to the death camp. Many of my relatives were deported to Treblinka during this great deportation. Where they were gassed. They very likely passed through this place on their way. That includes my grandmother's brothers and sisters, Elias and his wife Gitla and 2 of their 3 boys, and her uncle Shaya and Aunt Vega and her cousin Bina. My grandmother didn't know that at the time, though. In her mind, they died when the uprising ended and the ghetto was destroyed. Towards the end of the war, my mother and grandparents were in the woods surrounding Warsaw, hiding with the partisans and waiting for the war to end. It seemed to take forever. They could hear the guns of the Russian army across the Vistula River, but they never seemed to get any closer. And then on one cold evening in January 1945, the Russians finally arrived and Warsaw was liberated. My grandmother says that she remembered it got very, very quiet. The war was over. Amazingly, my grandparents, Esther and Kalman, and my mother, Judith, had all survived. They were sent to a displaced persons camp where other refugees waited and tried to determine what to do next. The displaced persons camps, DP camps they were called, were set up to help with the enormous challenge of the 15 to 20 million refugees that existed when World War II ended. The refugees were malnourished and hungry, sick or dying, and grieving the loss of everything they knew. They had nowhere to go. DP camps all over Europe provided food and shelter as well as healthcare. In the DP camp, my grandparents said they spent all of their time trying to determine if anyone else had survived. There was a wall where people put up signs. I'm looking for Feldmans from Warsaw, Listopada Avenue. Esther Kalman and Judith Scheinfeld have all survived. With the help of the tracing service provided by the Red Cross, my grandmother eventually found her brother Menashe, who was a young man, and eventually her mother Hannah and sister Bella, who was a grown woman. Bella had been a teenager when my grandmother, her sister, had last seen her. Hannah and Bella had been to many work camps and concentration camps, but incredibly, they both managed to survive. And my grandmother found her cousin Julius, too, the oldest of Elias and Gitla's 3 boys. He had survived the Warsaw Ghetto, one of only a small number of people who were able to do so. He was not a fighter, but he helped in his own ways by sneaking in and out of the ghetto to help transport items that the resistance needed. My grandfather also found 3 brothers who were liberated from the concentration camps. My mother remembered her time in the displaced persons camp very fondly. They were required to go to school, but most of the kids she hung out with liked to play hooky and climb through the rubble that was left after the US and Allied forces bombings at the end of the war. There were mountains of rubble, and my mother described herself as the ringleader of a pack of very dirty children who invented games and stayed out every day until the last rays of the sun disappeared. She knew there were unexploded bombs in there, but she was brave, and after all, she had been through much worse. Eventually, my grandparents left the DP camp and moved to Stuttgart, Germany. My grandparents tried very hard to put the war behind them. This picture of my grandparents was taken very shortly after they left the DP camp, and it always takes me aback. It's a professional photograph that shows them as a stylish young couple, my grandmother with her fur coat, my grandfather holding a French magazine, despite the fact that he did not speak French. I imagine them finally putting some weight back after they had been starving and deciding that they wanted to show the world they were back. And this is my mom after the war, dressed up for the cold German winter. In the meantime, my grandfather started doing business, selling aspirin, which was in short supply after the war. He bought and sold items on the black market, a kind of underground economy that broke the official rules about what could be bought and sold and for how much. Eventually, they moved to Berlin, where my grandfather and his 3 brothers opened a store that sold fur coats and hats. And this is a picture of the family from around that time. It always seemed very strange to me that Jews from Warsaw who had barely survived the war would move to Berlin, Germany of all places, afterwards, the heart of the Nazi Empire. But the fact is that many Polish Jews were never able to go home. They weren't welcome there. Their homes and possessions had been taken or sold. Their neighborhoods did not want them. Some who went home were killed. My family felt safer in Berlin, where the American and Russian soldiers stayed for many years. Berlin is also where my mother learned to play the piano. My grandfather didn't want my mother to go to German schools. He didn't trust the German educational system, but he thought music would be okay. So he sent her to the Berlin Conservatory, a famous music school where she learned piano and music theory, but no other subjects. When she came to the United States in 1949, at age 13, she had really never been to school. But the Holocaust had a profound impact that they all carried with them for the rest of their lives. My mother had been a child of only 3 when the war started and 9 when it ended. It was hard for her to talk about what happened during that period. The only real story that I have from my mother's personal memory was something that happened early in the war when she was on the trains being transported to the camps. As a small child, she had watched someone being shot and killed by a guard. She was only able to talk about this once with my father. Aside from that one instance, she simply never discussed this period of her life. But the enormity of it was always with her, and it came out in strange ways. I remember once we were traveling together abroad and crossing a border in Europe where there were border guards in uniform. I looked over at my mother, and she was in a panic, shaking and white, as though she was transported back to a previous time when a policeman or a soldier was a dangerous threat. I remember that a common topic of conversation in our family was trying to figure out why they had survived, why them and not others. They were trying to make sense out of something that really didn't make any sense. Often the answer they came up with was that my grandfather was just a completely unpredictable person. When everybody else went right, he went left. And the thought was that it made him hard for the Nazis to find and capture. My mother's opinion was that they survived because my grandmother had light skin and blonde hair, and she spoke Polish and German fluently. She could pass as Christian. My grandmother, being a more spiritual person, looked at it a different way. She felt there must have been some reason that God had kept her alive. Early in the war, when they were being transported from camp to camp, there was a time when the small children were being rounded up in the camp to be transported on another train. There was a little girl, 4 or 5 years old, who had lost her mother. She was all alone and frightened. My grandmother motioned to her to come with them, and she hid this little girl under her long skirt to keep her from being taken. Whatever happened to that little girl, we don't know. But in my grandmother's mind, it was that one simple act of love and resistance that protected her from all the near-death experiences she had in those years of war and destruction. It took me many years to find out what happened to my grandmother's cousins, these 2 boys, Mordechai and Bronik. A few years ago, I was researching the people in this photograph to find out more about my family. I had assumed that all of Shaya's family had been killed, but I was wrong. I happened to stumble on a family that had similar names and a descendant who lived in Toronto. I didn't think they were relatives, but there was no point in leaving any stone unturned, so I contacted this gentleman in Toronto. In our conversation, he mentioned that there were 2 boys, one of whom was his grandfather, and that they had run away before the police had come to take the family. His family name was Lobart, and I was looking for Lubarts. Could this be the missing boys? This gentleman and I spoke for 90 minutes, but neither one of us could convince the other that we were family. Finally, I said, listen, let me send you this family picture I have and see if you can recognize anyone. So I texted him this picture. A few minutes later, he texted me the same picture back on a table in his family's home. Looks familiar, he texted. I had found them, and a branch of my family that was lost to me. Like so many families who survived the Holocaust, my family was also separated. Some to America, some to Israel, others to Canada and Germany. Whatever country would take them, they had to go. My mother and her parents were so happy to move to this country. When my mom and her parents came to the United States in 1949, they came on this gigantic boat, the General W.M. Black, filled with other refugees, Jewish refugees from Europe. They had lived 10 years of chaos, but they were also leaving behind their home and everything they knew to start an entirely new life in a place they had never been before. They moved to Chicago and then to New York, and then eventually to New Jersey, where my grandfather started a chicken farm. My mother started high school having never learned math or science or language arts, and she didn't know any English either. But she threw herself into her studies, learned English, and tried to become an average American teenager. She wanted to leave what happened behind her. A few years after she arrived, and just before her 18th birthday, my mom marched herself down to the county office in Ocean City, New Jersey, and took a very important multiple choice test, the U.S. Citizenship exam. This is her certificate of naturalization. She was so proud and honored that day. My grandparents also became U.S. citizens, but they didn't blend in quite the same way that my mom did. And they remained connected to Poland in a way that my mother didn't at all. My grandmother always kept with her these 3 postcards, which were tucked into her address book. This was also something that I discovered only recently when I found her address book. To have kept them for so long, I imagined that each one represented something extremely important to her. On the left, the market square at the center of Warsaw. In the middle, Murstow Square, and on the right, Jerusalem Avenue, where the trolley ran. I've put her postcards beside the photographs of each place before the war, so that you can see what they were like before they were destroyed. The market square in the center of Warsaw, Murstow Square in the Ghetto, where the fighting was so intense during the uprising, and Jerusalem Avenue. Was this the trolley line she was on that fateful night when she had nowhere to go? As I said, she kept these postcards with her until her death. I find it interesting that she chose to remember these places in the state of destruction, which must have been the way that they looked the last time she saw them at the end of the war. As I look at my family's smiling faces, I know they would later endure persecution, injustice, cruelty, and violence. But I also knew that they would exemplify resistance, resilience, bravery, and love. My grandmother, who risked her life to save a child she did not know, and a trolley conductor who risked her life to save my mother and grandmother sleeping on a streetcar. And by the way, those 2 ladies, my grandmother Esther and the trolley conductor Stefcha, they were friends for their entire lives. And this is the 2 of them together in California many, many years after the war. You can see my grandmother, the shorter one on the left, still had the same hairdo, and it was still perfect. I hope that the story that I told you today gives you a better sense of what life was like in these times. Everyone who survived and everyone who didn't. They were all people with families and lives, occupations and hobbies, thoughts and dreams. Thank you for letting me tell you the story of this photograph, the story of my family.
Whew. I'm very emotional. It's an incredible story, and you tell it so beautifully. Thank you. And it's one thing after the other. It's really striking to me what a miraculous story this is of resistance, escape, hiding, resilience, despite your grandmother's nervousness. That one detail is so interesting. And losing and finding family, enduring friendships. It has it all. And it's just so beautiful. So I can't thank you enough for sharing it so bravely and so beautifully.
My pleasure, Lauren.
Uh,
Thank you for the opportunity.
so I have to ask you a couple of questions.
Please.
How do you cope with telling such an emotional story about your family members and your mother? And from where do you draw your strength to tell the story?
Yeah. Well, when I first started to tell the story, I became very emotional during the telling of the story. I would often cry during the telling of the story, especially certain parts, like, the part where my grandmother and my mother have to go out and celebrate the destruction of the ghetto, and the part where she saves this little girl are very, very emotional moments in the story. I think as I have told it many times, I have the ability to kind of step back a little bit and see the bigger picture. And as you say, see it as part of a broader picture of many pieces that lead to this kind of conclusion of survival and resilience and the ability to kind of build the family back together. And so I'm able to kind of see it from that bigger point of view, and that makes it easier to tell it.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned resilience just now, and it's a word that really jumped out at me as you were telling the story. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on the resilience of your family members. And it also seems just a really timely concept for everything that we've been going through lately, with the pandemic, now a year and a half. We're a year and a half in. But I just would love to hear your thoughts about resilience.
Sure. For sure, they were incredibly resilient people. And my brother and I often in our lives have reminded ourselves at difficult points in our lives that we come from a family of survivors, resilient people who were able to get through something incredibly difficult. I think they all had their own ways of coping after the events of the Holocaust. My grandparents were storytellers, and they wanted to tell everything. And part of their resilience was in the retelling of these stories to my brother, to me, to their friends. They bonded with other Holocaust survivors and kind of created very close networks of friends. For my mother, the way she expressed her resilience was in her incredible determination and her kind of like amazing drive. She was busy 25 hours a day and always wanting to do something and make something, create things, do good in the world. So I think all of them in their own way are amazing models of resilience that, certainly our family looks to. Even in these days of, challenges that we are living through today, to remember that, we have within us so much more than we think.
You mentioned that your family after surviving, went to Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're many generations since then. But I wonder how you feel about Germany, how you feel toward the German people today.
Yeah. So growing up, I'll start there and then I'll tell you kind of where I've come to. I would say growing up, I got very mixed messages. On the one hand, my family refused to buy any kind of German products, German cars, et cetera, probably based on factual information about some of the involvement of some of the large corporations. But at the same time, my mother wanted to go to Germany all the time, and she would go there 2 times a year if she could. She loved going to Germany. She never went to Warsaw. She never went to Poland, never in her life, but she went to Germany all the time, and I went with her very frequently. Interestingly, I would say later in life, especially over the last 5 to 10 years, as I have been working through my story and my family's history, et cetera, I've had 2 opportunities, one of them brought to me through the Holocaust Center, which have really shaped a very different opinion of the German people. One of these things was that I had the opportunity to have a wonderful student who had come to work in Pittsburgh. She was between kind of her high school and her next, sort of graduate career as a medical student. And she was here for a year, and she lived with us for let's see, 8-9 months, I think. And I had the chance through her eyes to understand how the German government and educational system have really brought this story, really sort of brought a kind of a reckoning among the German people, and really helped the next generations to process what happened, to take, to have that accountability, but also to really think about how to prevent it from happening again. So that was one important thing. The other very important thing was that my husband, actually, who is also a child of survivor, who was German, went and got German citizenship. And I was very fortunate to accompany him to the consulate in New York a few years ago, where he was presented with his, certificate, his German papers. And I was really moved by what the consulate said at the time. The consul was there, and he said that although the German people could not change the events of what happened, that this granting of German citizenship back to people who originally had it, to the ancestors of the people who had it, was a way that the Germans had to kind of repair a little bit of the damage that was done. And that really all of these things have really given me a much more nuanced view of, of Germany and of the German people. And so I'm really grateful over the last few years to have had that ability to kind of see this very different side.
And I've shared in some of those experiences with you, and it's the same for many of us in the community of the Holocaust Center, I would say. And through our involvement with the Lest We Forget exhibit, which is currently on tour around train stations everywhere in Germany. It's in Nuremberg right now, with photographs of Pittsburgh Holocaust survivors.
Wow.
It has been an incredible and constantly evolving and deepening relationship with people in Germany.
Yes.
And yes, and your role in hosting Stella was so important for everyone. And yes, so I'm glad to think of her now. She was very important for our story, for sure.
Absolutely. And
yes,
our family too. Yeah, we loved having her.
Yes, I know. And she loved being with you, which was so important to giving her a good experience here. So, okay. So going back to your work to tell your story and your family's story, how were you able to do the research? Because I could see that you had to go down a lot of kind of winding alleys and paths to find it. Can you tell us how you did it, working with limited information? And a follow-up to that, do you know how your family preserved their photographs?
Okay. Well, the photographs first. There were photographs in the photographs that I showed today that are family photographs that came after the war. The only photograph that was before the war is the main photograph that I show of my entire family, and it's not actually clear how that was preserved. I think that the most likely explanation is that Hannah, my great-grandmother, and Shaya, her brother, actually had 2 older siblings who immigrated to the United States before the war. And my guess is that that picture was sent or brought to the United States, and everything was probably destroyed in Europe, certainly all of their personal belongings. But when they got to the United States, I think they picked that picture up and then sort of, sent it around to everybody. So that's my guess. The other question that you asked is kind of, how did I do it? And I have to tell you, it took about 3 years to put everything together. It was really a long process. I started with all of the family stories, just talking to everybody that I could find, my brother, cousins, anybody that I could find that knew anything, and writing down as many stories as I could, and then trying to put them into kind of chronological order as best as I could. I was very fortunate, again, through the Holocaust Center, to be able to find a researcher at the United States Holocaust Memorial. And she was able to help me find certain archives that I had not been able to identify, where I could find a lot of the primary material on, what displaced person camp and what boat they came over on, and all of these kinds of, missing little details that I wanted for the story. And then a lot of it was, tracing through the ancestry portals and materials to find other information. A lot of the information came from, the German government or the United States, government and military who were there at the DP camp. So it was really a mishmash of stuff, Laurel. It took a long time.
I mean, I feel like I was with you along the journey, because I know that it's very hard, and you were able to find so much incredible information and craft the story so beautifully. I wonder if you could just, I guess at this point it's a little bit of speculation, but what lessons do you want students to take away from hearing your mother's story? And if you can think of what she would want students to take away.
That last one's hard, because she really didn't say much. But I can tell you what I would hope that people take away from this. I think first thing is to recognize that there are lots of parallels in this story to stories that go on all the time right now, whether it is genocides that go on across the world, whether it is the way that we treat immigrants, millions of immigrants in Europe. We have similar problems these days, whether it is how people in authority can sometimes be subverted to do things that that as a community, as a population, they may not even be aware that they are headed down a road to actions that are really morally reprehensible. They may not be aware that they're going down that road. So in all of those ways, I feel that there are so many present day lessons to be learned from these stories.
You talked about what's happened in Germany now, and you talked about the reckoning that's taken place and the repair that has gone on over the decades since the Holocaust, and it's an ongoing effort in Germany. We're in a similar kind of time in our country. Mm-hmm. Since the murder of George Floyd last summer, we saw the beginnings of a long overdue reckoning with our country's racist past, from the genocide of indigenous peoples to slavery to the forms of prejudice that continue today. And at least in my lifetime, I haven't seen anything like it. But I worry a year in that there's also a counterattack happening, a counter movement against the progress that I think we all saw happening. Mm-hmm. So I want to ask you a more personal kind of question, if I may. Sure. I mentioned in my introduction that you're a leader of our Generations group. And our Generations group, for people who aren't familiar, is descendants of Holocaust survivors, some of whom tell their families' stories, as you did today, and some of whom are just part of the group. And it's more, support for the Holocaust Center and a social kind of network. One thing that you have brought to the group as head of our generations group is the idea to share your stories and your family stories with people in Pittsburgh who have experienced generational trauma. And I'm wondering if you can talk to us about that a little bit. I am so moved by this because this is the direction the Holocaust Center is going in too. Mm-hmm. Following on what you said, we know that these stories of survival, resilience, resistance during the Holocaust relate to things that are happening now. Why is it important for you and other descendants of survivors to work with other marginalized communities who've suffered from trauma? And what motivates you to do the work?
Yeah. Well, I think what motivates me is somewhat the easiest thing, because I think for many of us whose families have experienced this and for whom that trauma continues, although certainly not to the degree that they experienced it, I think that we see in these stories a common and very difficult thread of what happens in societies, which is that, marginalized people can become the targets of hate, injustice, violence, etc. And I think because of our history, we have a kind of empathy, and we don't know what their experience is. We don't live in their shoes. But on the other hand, we have that kind of historical sense of empathy, that we understand what can be done to a group like the Jews of Europe. And these things are not on off. It's neither, it's not always the Holocaust or everything's perfect. There are a lot of things that happen in the middle, and we can slide towards authoritarianism. We can slide towards, violence against underrepresented groups, marginalized groups, and we can turn that dial as a society more and more towards this terrible place that we don't want to go. And I think, children of survivors see that very, very clearly. We see all of that as a kind of an analogy in many ways to kind of what our families experienced. And so it's some of it's empathy, some of it's just like, we want to put out a warning, to other people, like, open your eyes, look at what is going on. And I think we feel a responsibility to do that because, really, in many ways, because our families survived, we have a responsibility to do that.
It's such an inspiration. And this is one way where our generations group is doing things that, we're networked all over the country and actually around the world with other Holocaust resource organizations and museums, memorials. And our generations group has done things differently. And when I met with you and with the other two women who run this group, I was really I couldn't get over it, because to have that feeling that you should pay this back, that your perspective is the perspective that we always talk about, building bridges. We're in Pittsburgh, we love bridges, but this is the way to make connections with communities that might think that there are too many differences between us to ever bridge that divide. And it's one way that we find out we're really speaking the same language and we're stronger together.
Absolutely.
And I love that. It is a top priority of our organization, and you are a leader. You're leading by example, by really, pushing us with these kinds of ideas and inspiration. So it's so wonderful to work with you and just to have your leadership as part of the center.
Well, thank you so much, Lauren. It's such a pleasure. It's so wonderful to work with the Holocaust Center. And I really appreciate all that your entire staff has done to help me to put this together, because it was not easy. So I'm very grateful for their help in preserving this history.
Thank you for saying that. And I know I speak for all of us in saying that it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.